people like to harp on the bad news. I think it's okay to be galvanized by research, but we should never accentuate the negatives for the shock factor. We've been praying for a moment like this. Gen Z is very open spiritually, and they're very open to Jesus.
All right, we are again here with a conversation with Kinnaman, stats in the Sprinter van. Well, here's one that I've heard as credit to you. 88% of evangelical youth drop out of church after high school, never to return. And I'm always fascinated by the phrase, never to return, with such confidence. Because that means you literally have to implant tracking chips in the neck of all American teenagers.
And then go into the future.
Exactly. So that was, of course, I debunked that stat years ago. That was a wonderful group of youth pastors who kind of made a bunch of guesses and then averaged their guesses and then said Barna. So talk to us about the next generation, because dropouts is a real issue. It's a real problem. Yeah. Again, we don't have the charts in front of us, but give us your general picture of what it looks like.
Well, I'll kind of walk you through the backstory of how this came to be, and even kind of some of the backstory on some of those stats, which was I'd been working at Barna since 1995. And since I was 21, and around the age of 28 or maybe 29, I was looking at some of the crosstabs, looking at the differences between different age groups, and it really hit me that 20-somethings were the least religiously active. It's sort of like teenagers, and then this huge gap.
All right, big drop,
and then 30s, 40s, 50s, doing a lot of comparison over even at that time, about 20 years of history. The drop was even more accentuated, in that late 90s, early 2000s.
Right.
And so we launched a web article called 20-somethings Struggle to Find Their Place in Christian Churches. And that went viral. We had
crazy.
We had lots of readers on that article. It wasn't autobiographical because I never dropped out of the church, but I was experiencing a lot of people that I knew and grew up with, and just this, this sense of disconnection that the church was losing people. So anyway, that led into a book called Unchristian, a book called You Lost Me, where I really tried to explore that.
And they blew up.
Yeah.
They blew up. So Unchristian was based on, you explain it, you unpack it.
It was interviews with non-Christians who were 16 to 29.
Right.
And one of my really good friends, Gabe Lyons, and I worked on that. And originally that was going to be called The Brand of Christianity.
Oh, interesting.
And we ended up retitling it called Unchristian. But, we were looking at, what were the brand attributes, positive and negative.
How people perceive Christianity.
Correct, from the outside in.
Right.
And we, I think, had a chance to have a really interesting conversation. I actually heard from a pretty prominent Jewish researcher who had read that book years later, and he was at Stanford, and he was he's like, hey, Unchristian was very interesting because it was like this inside look, critiquing from within.
Right.
And, both Gabe and I continue to be very hopeful about the church and the evangelical community and its essential role in our society, and, the need for people to know and follow Jesus. But we were talking a lot about some of the challenges there in that book. And again, it struck a chord because I think it was trying to be a faithful critique from within.
Sure.
Even the notion of talking about the hypocrisy of the church. It was a hard book to write.
Yeah, I imagine.
And then, trying to navigate that. So getting back to this idea of the dropout problem, that first book was really looking at non-Christians and their attitudes towards the church, that the church was anti-homosexual and judgmental and hypocritical and too political. And then the second project was really You Lost Me, which was why do people drop out?
Right.
And it's about 60% of young people who are teenage churchgoers, who are not 20-something churchgoers, but they're not all losing their faith. Most of them are what we call sort of nomads, and they were people.
I like that language that you coined there.
Yeah. So prodigals are those who lose their faith. Nomads are those who kind of wander from their faith, and then exiles was this group that were still involved in the church, but had some deeper questions that the church was not really squarely answering. So it was those three different kinds of You Lost Me journeys that I thought could be helpful. And again, the fact that people, they do like to drum up, and I do think sometimes people like to harp on the bad news and they get riled up about it. And I think it's okay to be galvanized by research, but we should never accentuate the negatives for for the shock factor.
Yeah. So, all right. So then 60% drop out, or at some level of dropout. So
Yeah.
we did a project a few years ago, and you could really see that around 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, those seem to be those pivotal years.
Yeah.
What are some of the factors that led people to drop out?
One thing to answer there is that the gap between going from being a teenager in a home to out on your own is one of those like life stage things that every generation has to deal with. But the particular ways that the institutions support that transition, they don't work as well. So like, at a college or university, we often hear from admissions professionals and residential student directors, like there's a gap in maturity,
Right,
and
right.
there's a difference today compared to 20 years ago. So there's this whole sociological factor that growing up is harder. It's got, like Jonathan Haidt writes about the anxious generation.
Right.
So there's a lot of those things that are kind of, they're age old, but they're very particular to this particular time. So, questions of science, questions, is the scriptures anti-science? Is the Christian way sexually repressive? Are you sheltered, and you believe stupid things? And a lot of like hurt, like disillusionment with the business of ministry. People saying, the youth pastor is paid to be my friend.
Sure.
Some of those kinds of questions about the structure of church-based ministry. So each individual story, when I looked at the data for unchristian and non-Christians, there was a lot of similar answers, because if a lot of the negative perceptions are sort of generated or at least perpetuated by media. In the You Lost Me research, it was almost all individual stories. Like if you only had seen what this pastor said, or if you'd only known what my intellectual questions, there were some that were very intellectually driven, like, a God that can hear the prayers of 8 billion people just doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
Very intellectual, kind of philosophical, metaphysical questions. But many of them were just actually really relational. Like I didn't actually just want to be a Christian. The people were judgmental, and they didn't like me, and I was sort of judged for things that didn't seem fair, and a lot of the relational disconnections were really huge.
You Lost Me was again a significant moment in Christian culture. I don't know anyone who didn't read that book. So what are the solutions? What can churches do to build a greater sense of engaging and keeping the next generation?
Well, first, let's remind ourselves that there seems to be a real resurgence of interest in Jesus today, that we've been praying for a moment like this. Gen Z is very open spiritually, and they're very open to Jesus. So let's thank Jesus. Let's thank the Holy Spirit that he is alive and at work now as always. And there seems to be a lot of open questions and real hunger spiritually among Gen Z. That was not the case 10 years ago.
Well, sure,
it wasn't the case 5 years ago at the same level.
Yeah.
Point to the themes of a large study we did on resilience, on resilient disciples, which was 5 factors: identity in Jesus, that people have a conversational relationship with Jesus. They believe Jesus brings them deep joy and satisfaction. Belief that the Bible is authoritative in their lives. They are around and in meaningful relationships, especially with older adults. They have a sense that their purpose in life, even and especially if it's outside the church, like not a pastor or a missionary, is a sacred calling. And then they live a life of sacrifice and service, and they're sort of prepared for suffering. So those are these 5 themes that we discovered from a project on resilient disciples. But I actually think there's just a lot of hunger for this generation to be trained, to learn. I actually think everybody needs a theological degree and training of some sort. My daughter Emily, she was telling me how she's listened to 15 hours of analysis on just like one music album. It's like a podcast series. And, she's awesome, she's smart, she's well-read, and if one music album from Kendrick Lamar is deserving of 15 hours of analysis, wouldn't the Trinity be worth a couple hours of thoughtful reflection? And so the solution I'm suggesting is, in addition to teaching and preaching, we also need very thoughtful and incremental training, like seminaries and colleges and universities provide, and we need to make sure it's really oriented to the questions that this generation is asking.
David Kinnaman, thanks for joining us in Conversations with Kinnaman.